Chapter 1, A New World, and welcome to American history. We're going to spend a little bit of time going over the population of how we got here and who was here and etc. It's called the settling of the Americas. Now, the common accepted theory today is that people from the Asian continent of what we now know as Russia migrated out of that area over what we call the Bering Strait. At that time in history, 15 to 60,000 years ago, there was an ice bridge between part of Alaska and Russia. We call these people who migrated Palo-Indians, and the general, again, accepted theory is that they came following game because they were hunter-gatherers. As they would hunt game to extinction, they would move on to other lands. Eventually, they did develop agriculture such as maize, squash, and beans. And when the development of agriculture started to grow, well, the necessity for moving around as much kind of slowed down or stopped entirely, because the main reason for moving was to find more food to eat. But if you've got food to eat, you don't have to go travel that far. And once you stop, you begin to see something called civilization develop. This is basically a map. As you can see, this area up in here, over here would be Russia, and right here would be the ice bridge that they came across. We've heard some theories that some came by boat. There again, it's theories, and we have found some remnants of boats, but we're just not 100% sure, so we're going to go with the fact that they came across the Bering Strait. Some went north, fewer of them did, because we're in an ice age. Most of them came down and stayed pretty close to the western coast because it was warm, and the glaciers were still just beginning to go back. And they would go further and further south, and most of them did go on down into Central and South America. And they had multitude of societies, and these people, looking at it from the European point of view, were nothing, but they had cities, thousands of people, sometimes 100 or 200,000 people living in a city. They had roads, they had irrigation, they had trade networks, they had architecture, they had literature, but they had no metal tools. They didn't have any machines. They had no need for them. Of course, they had never even heard of gunpowder, and why learn navigational, sea navigational things when you weren't going to be able to see, you're on the land. But the main thing they did not have was any resistance to European diseases because they'd never been exposed to them. So let's spend a few minutes on the Native Americans, if you would, in the area. About 3,500 years ago, in the area of the Mississippi River, they had what they called the mound builders. They built semicircular mounds to bury people in, and they had trade routes. We found out a lot about them because they ate a lot of fish from the river, and archaeologists love what we would call a trash heap, because what people throw away tells you a lot about them. The northeastern Arizona Indians were the Hopi and the Zuni. They lived in villages. They learned how to do irrigation, and they had dams, they had canals, and they had trade. They knew how to farm. Some of these places even had inside running water. On the Pacific coast, there was hundreds, maybe even thousands of independent tribes, and they lived by fishing and hunting and gathering, predominantly fishing, and they also had trade routes. On the Great Plains, of course, they hunted buffalo, or they had agriculture, but the most, I guess you would say, advanced Indians lived on the eastern North American coast: the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Iroquois, and although not mentioned, the Creek Indian. They hunted, they gathered, they fished, they had agriculture, they had trade with each other, but they didn't always get along, because sometimes they'd be at war. And when the Europeans finally arrived, they found all these different languages, because every tribe had their own language, they had their own custom, and although not accepted by the Europeans, they had their own political system, they had their own religion. I mean, each tribe was a unique little self-contained community. As this map shows you, you can see there were Indians all over the place. John White was an American artist who came, I guess, in the late 1400s, early 1500s. And this is a hand drawing of what he saw. He saw peaceful Indians dancing around poles. Now, all religions and all practices of our Native Americans, they related in some way or another to hunting and fishing or farming because this is what they did. They invested everything living, invested not everything living, but everything with spiritual power. Living things are not, but usually living things such as an animal, a tree, and you can say a tree is living or not depending on your outlook on life, but if it didn't live, it wouldn't grow. Everything had some type of spiritual connection. And each tribe believed that, that there was a god of the water, a god of the trees, a god of the moose, a god of the sky. But there was always one single boss god that were above everybody else. Land was not privately owned, communal based. And their theory being, how can you own the land that you can't, well, you can't own the air that you breathe. How could you, it's just there for everybody to use. And it's going to cause big problems. What about gender? Well, unlike Europe, where everything is very patriarchal, matrilineal is pretty much what they did in the Indian tribes. It does not mean that the woman could become a chief. It just meant that power came through her side. And when there was children in a marriage, the children would be raised by the mother's family. So you had to be careful of your marriage and careful of who you married because that's where the power was. Women could not own property in Europe. They could in the New World. The Indian lady could own property. Premarital sex, yes, you could do that in the Indian tribe, but you could not do that in Europe. In Europe, you couldn't get a divorce. You couldn't take part in religion. But in this world, you could. An Indian maiden could get a divorce. She could take part in religious ceremonies. And she could even help select the chief because she was the right female tribe, or part of the tribe. Not only was that, she was a caregiver, she was a cook, and more important than anything else, folks, she controlled the food distribution. If she decided that this warrior that came in had not done his part, she could withhold food from him. And when you control the food distribution, that gives you a very important position in the tribe. The men, they were political. They were leaders. They went hunting. They went to war. This was their job. The woman's job was to be the caregiver, the cook, control the food, take part in everything that went along in the village. She was the caregiver. So depending on your point of view, they were either noble savages or uncivilized barbarians. Unfortunately, the negative uncivilized barbarians was usually the dominant feeling. When the European looked at the Native American, they saw a lack of religion. They didn't believe in Jesus. They didn't know about Christianity. This land use, what do you mean everybody uses the land? You've got to own the land. And women allowed to make decisions, participate in religion, and have premarital sex? Ooh. And because of this uncivilized attitude, the English, the French, and the Dutch, and the Spanish, well, it justified exploration. I mean, the men were lazy. They just sit around under trees and smoke peace pipes and talk about things and go hunting and fishing. But this was the thing a gentleman did in Europe. The common everyday man, of course, couldn't do this. He had to work to make a living. If you were a gentleman or of the upper class, this is what you did for fun. And the women are working in the fields. Well, this was their job. They enjoyed it. They helped them control the food. But in Europe, the women did not work in the fields. That was a man's job. So you've got this difference of opinion right off the bat. And when they looked, they didn't see any form of government. They didn't see any side of a legal system. And apparently the Indians had no respect for authority, and there was no discipline there. Because in Europe, freedom meant ownership of private property. Whereas the Indian emphasized the commitment to family and community. And self-determination, mutual obligations to each other, and group autonomy. You worked as a group. So different from Europe. But Europe believed freedom was a collection of rights and privileges reserved for a very small portion of the population. Everybody wasn't entitled. And of course, Christian liberty meant subordinating yourself to a Christian God. Now, every country over there had an established church. The king would decide what the religion was. And the government got often suppressed or regulated other non-Christian groups. It wasn't often, it was the rule of thumb. The church was decided by the government, and you could go to bed a Catholic and wake up a Protestant. You could go to bed a Protestant and wake up a Quaker. You and I, the common folk, had nothing to say about our religion. Of course, liberty depended on the obedience to the law in any country and knowing your place in society. Now stop and think a minute. Did you ever hear your grandmother or your mother say, "Who do you think you are?" And of course, you had no immediate answer, but what they're doing is they're going back to the 1500s and 1600s when you had a place in society. And if you stepped out of your place in society, you could be very harshly punished. If your father was a baker, you were going to be a baker. And kings, they believed in divine rule. There was nothing between was you, the king, and God. And every family was like a little kingdom. The head of the family, the father, was a little king. His women, his children, his servants, everyone were his subjects. In Europe, women could not vote. If they were unfortunate enough to have to work for wages, they did not have control of their wages. Their husband would pick up their money. They couldn't write a will. They couldn't get a divorce. And if their husband divorced them, they did not get custody of their children. The important thing in Europe was to own land, because if you owned land, you could vote. That meant that you were part of politics. If you had a piece of land, you could support your family. If you could vote and you could support your family, that means you were very important in the community. So owning land, having that little piece of paper saying that piece of land belongs to you, was extremely important to the Europeans. There was no freedom of religion or speech. The freedom of speech that you've heard about for the English was not for you and me. It was for the people who were in Parliament. You could say what you wanted to against the king in Parliament, but once you stepped outside of Parliament, you couldn't. If you defied your employer in any way, you could be subject to not only criminal penalties, but you could go to jail. And yet each country, whether it was France or Spain or Holland or Germany or whoever, they all claimed to be spreading freedom and Christianity. In other words, the 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. You're spreading Christianity, you're obtaining gold for your country, and glory for your monarch. Of course, they're all looking for a shortcut to Spice Islands and cut out that Muslim middleman because, well, Muslim middleman, let me tell you a little bit of information not in the text. In the year 1400 Common Era, nobody could see ahead of what's coming. Europe seemed to be on the edge of something, but it didn't seem to be on the edge of becoming the world center of commerce. By every standard, China, under the Ming Dynasty, was the world's most complex culture. In the 15th century, the 1400s, the government of China was staffed by very well-educated bureaucrats. And they ruled over 100 million people. The Chinese invented the compass, gunpowder, forms of printing, and paper money. And of course, those silks and teas they had, they were only available in China. Everybody wanted some of them. Most of the people in Europe knew about China a little bit, especially from the travels of Marco Polo, who was a merchant from the Italian city-state of Venice, who had gone to Chinese court in 1271 and served the Emperor Kublai Khan for almost 20 years. The Khan's capital city, which we call today Beijing, was the world's largest and grandest. And Mr. Marco Polo reported that he received more than 1,000 cartloads of silk every day. And he insisted that China outshone any European city and culture in the world. And the Chinese agreed. Between 1405 and 1434, a royal eunuch, you know what a eunuch is, Chang Ho, led 6 large fleets, not 6 ships, 6 large fleets. We're talking about dozens of ships from China to the East Indies and the coast of East Africa. They traded and explored along the way. Then they were large enough that they sailed around the southern tip of Africa and discovered Europe. Now, had China thrown its resources and talents into overseas expansion, the subsequent history of the world would have been vastly different. You and I'd be speaking Chinese. But most of what the Chinese learned about the outside world, it only confirmed their belief that other cultures, they had nothing to offer their celestial kingdom. So no one followed Chang Ho, especially after he died. The Europe emperor abandoned the construction of any ocean-going ships and later forbade anyone to own a vessel with more than 2 simple masts. So China became a very self-contained economic and political system that did not need the rest of the world. And that raises a question, what would have happened had she not stopped? Now, whether you want to realize it or not, each one of us individuals has their own specific body odor. I'm not talking about sweat from working in the fields or not taking a bath, but each of us has our own peculiar odor, if you would. The Italians, whether you like to admit it or not, because they eat so much garlic, sometimes their body has a slight garlicky smell. According to the Chinese, we were too tall, we were too pale, we stank because we ate meat. And when you eat meat, you have a certain body odor, whereas the Chinese ate rice and fish predominantly. So they had a different body odor. And our gods were different. I mean, we had nothing that they wanted, but they had what we wanted. Now, in 1400, space facts, Europe was a rather backward place. And although its location on what we call the Atlantic Rim, it made access to Asian trade, well, a little bit difficult. The Muslims, they control the overland trade with Asia, and the only known sea route to Asia was through the Persian Gulf. And as of 1400 Common Era, the Arabian mariners were the world's best. And since Marco Polo, especially in the Crusades, had introduced us to things like salt and fruit and vegetables and silks, we wanted some of these things. We wanted those Indian spices. But Europe wasn't producing anything that the Asians wanted to buy. So we had to pay for all these imports, but there was something very scarce called, well, silver and gold. So while Europe's influence of sphere of influence seemed to be shrinking, and China was perfectly content with what it already had, the Islamic nation was embarking on a, shall we say, a great phase of exploration and expansion. The Ottoman Turks took Constantinople in 1453 and overran the Balkans by 1520s, and they even threatened the little Italian city-state of Vienna. The Persian Empire rose to very new splendors at that time, and they began carrying the Quran into Indonesia and northern India. But while they were busy doing this, in all honesty, the European economy is making some gains. Now, this time frame historians call the Middle Ages. From 750 to 1540 Common Era is called the Middle Ages. By 1300, there's some improvements going on. We've got some improved plows, population increases, whereas back in 1300, with more than 100 million people living in Europe, the land couldn't sustain that kind of growth. And then there were years of famine because of, well, bad weather and bad crops and people dying and being undernourished. And then in 1340, something called the Black Death or the bubonic plague hit. The population of Europe was reduced by 1/3. And with recurring bouts of the plague, it kept the population down to around 1,500 for about 160 years. Meanwhile, the overworked soil not being worked because there's nobody around alive to work it, but gains its fertility. And as strange as it may seem, the per capita income began to rise among people who now had developed somewhat of an immunity to the disease. And the meteorological and agricultural endeavors that people were making were starting to be advanced. So at the end of these Middle Ages, something called the Renaissance is going to start. Of course, it starts in Italy. And people start thinking about the way it used to be in ancient Rome, ancient Greece. And a young German by the name of Johann Gutenberg invented something called the printing press with movable type in 1430. This allowed communication to be easier, where it used to be that if one town had one book and one person to read it, you were doing good. Now there could be larger libraries, and you could tell your tales of what's going to go happen, and you can read books by Marco Polo. The Arabians, by contrast, had been borrowing the printing from the Chinese and didn't give it up until the 1400s, the 15th century. But unlike China, none of Europe's kingdoms were self-contained. They all needed to trade with one another, and even with the non-Christian worlds, whether they wanted to or not. And no one single state had a monopoly on the manufacture of firearms or the flow of capital, which is going to prove a little bit advantageous here very shortly. So during the 1400s to 15th century, things are really starting to bubble all over the world. European societies begin to compete with one another. They're each trying to gain more resources, master new military techniques, something to make me better than my next door neighbor. And within a short 100 years, the European armies were far more formidable than they had been a century earlier. And the European fleets in the ocean is starting to, well, they could outsail a lot of rivals. It's during this time that we historians call the monarchical region states that were starting to grow and try to develop. And whereas the Norse who'd been exploring, we had the advantage of, we'd learned so much from the Crusaders bringing back information. We wanted stuff. We wanted spices. We wanted fruit. We wanted delicate glassware. We wanted these things called mirrors. We wanted handcrafted rugs. We wanted velvet cloths. We'd never heard of them before the Crusades, but now that we're getting stronger, we want this stuff. And it's going to be the city-states of Venice and Genoa that's going to take the lead. But Europe in 1400 is on the threshold of, as a dramatic expansion. A lot's going to happen in the next 100 years. But it's going to be a little tiny country called Portugal, located just west of Spain, that's going to lead the way. Because Portugal was a kingdom with less than 1 million people, and it had only been united for about 100 years. And it was really lagging behind those fancy Italian city-states and even England. It was small and it had very few resources. But Portugal had something that the others did not have. She had an efficient government. At a time when her neighbors were at war with each other, her location was ideal at the intersection of the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic world. And at first, the Portuguese mariners were interested in short-term gains rather than finding an all-water route to Asia. They really weren't that interested. They knew that the Arabian caravans across the Sahara Desert could bring gold, slaves, and ivory from Black Africa to Europe. And they believed that an Atlantic voyage to coastal points south of the Sahara could undercut the Arabian traders and bring in large profits. So in 1420, a member of the Portuguese royal family, Prince Henry, he became the head of something called the Crusading Order of Christ. And he used the monies from that organization to, shall we say, sponsor 15 voyages along the African coast. It took 14 years before the captains finally reached the Cape and explored the coastline and head further into the Atlantic out of sight of land. But these men, I can't even imagine what it must be like when you're still believing and, the earth is flat, and if you sail too far out, you're going to fall off, to have the intestinal fortitude to sail out of sight of land. Because of his efforts, Prince Henry, he was named a navigator, although he himself did not ever set sail. And by the end of the 1400s, as I said, they were navigating beyond the sight of land, and there wasn't any navigators around that could dutch them. They mapped the prevailing winds and the currents and the seas, and they collected every piece of geographical information they could. Then they started studying the design of the Arabian vessels. They copied them and improved on them. And I believe your text explains some of the designs and inventions borrowed by the Portuguese. So by 1450, they'd explored even further along the African coast south of the Sahara And at last they found the gold, ivory, and slaves that they'd been seeking. It was during their settling of colonies and the use of slave labor that the slave trade really took off, and we'll get more into that just a little bit later. But let it suffice to say it was the Portuguese who took the old method of enslaving your enemies and turned it to a very profitable business of buying and selling slaves. So paying for the trips to gold and slaves, the Portuguese exploration continued into the 1480s. They were looking for an all-water route to Asia. And in 1487, a man by the name of Bartholomew Diaz reached the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa and headed east toward the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, his crew rebelled and he had turned back. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama led a small fleet around the Cape of Good Hope and sailed on to the southeast coast of India. And the spices he brought back to Portugal yielded more than 20-to-1 profit for his investors. And to secure and protect their Asian trade, the Portuguese established a chain of naval bases that extended from East Africa to the mouth of the Persian Gulf and on to the coast of India. Some say they even penetrated the country of Japan, although that's more legend, I think, than actual fact. But strange as it may seem to us, other than securing their access to spices, the Portuguese did very little to govern their colonies. It would not be until the arrival in another hemisphere, specifically in Brazil, his settlement became even interesting to them, where they started to govern them. But here's a map that's going to show you just a little bit about some of their explorations. You can see how, I mean, here you've got Spain and this little bitty teeny tiny country of Portugal, and here she goes. At first she stayed close to the coast of Africa, but later on she came out further and came around the Cape of Good Hope. And they say that the turbulence and seas down here are just like someone's churning them all the time, all the way to India and then on to the East Indies. This is where they wanted to get the spices. But drawing on the successes of the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and the English, they're going to use this method of borrowing and learning new technology. But no matter how you look at it, it was an economic impulse that was behind colonization. And it was taking place long before this man called Christopher Columbus sailed west. It was a desire for the precious metals and spices that's going to launch the great age of discovery. So what is Spain? Spain, that big country on the other side, it only recently become united. One time she'd been a series of states and under the control of the Muslims, as a matter of fact. But through a series of wars and marriages, Spain had finally become consolidated. And when Prince Ferdinand of the country of Aragon and Princess Isabella of Castile got married, the country was finally united, and they kicked all of the Muslims out, and then they kicked all the Jews out. In 1492, they gave the Jews 6 months to become Christians or leave the country. Spain is going to become the most totally Catholic country of all of Europe. More than 80,000 Jews actually left. Problem is, these were people with money and knowledge, and it hurt them to lose these kind of people. So at the beginning of the 16th century, the 1500s, Spain was a very fiercely Catholic society, and the attitude is if you weren't Catholic, you were nothing. They brought with them to the Americas. Now, with all this stuff going on, with the new marriages and cooking the Moors out and kicking the Jewish people out, you'd think that, well, the government of Spain would have more to do than to listen to this crazy mariner called Christopher Columbus. He's saying the earth is round. He said, I can get all the way to India by sailing west. He's having a difficult time finding support, not so much on his ideas of the world not being flat, but on his ideas of it's too far. Now, Ferdinand and Isabel are short of cash because wars are expensive. So they agreed to gamble. What did they have to lose except for a few dollars that they invested? He'll either come back, make us wealthy, or he won't come back. There are some stories around that he and Queen Isabella were having an affair, but after looking at that picture of Christopher Columbus, can you really imagine the queen of a country is going to... No. His discovery of the New World are going to cause some problems between Spain and Portugal. Took him 33 days, and there was lots of controversy over what to do, and he finally arrived in an area we call today the Bahamas, on the island of Hispaniola. He returned to Spain with carrying some natives with him that he called the Indians because he thought he was in India. A year later, on his second trip, at the true beginnings of the Spanish colonization of the New World. As I said, it was taken for 3 G's. God, glory, and gold. Explorers from England, France, Portugal, they all came to the Americas. And some of the Spanish conquistadors, which were the, I guess you'd say, they were military men, explorers, Herman Cortez and Francisco Pizarro. And because of these men, we begin to see a flow of riches going back to Europe in big black ships about every 6 months. We begin to call this a Columbian exchange because from the New World, we had plants and animals and culture we took to Europe. Plants, disease, and animals from Europe. It's a two-way street. We shipped them potatoes and corn, and they shipped us back diseases. By the mid-1500s, Spain had an enormous global empire. As a matter of fact, she was bringing in so much gold into Europe that she, in effect, deflated the cost of it. The great Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were highways for her to move people and goods, and gold and silver. The precious jewels from Mexico and Peru were just going like crazy. But in the New World, there was no elected assemblies. There were bureaucrats controlled by the Spanish crown, and the Catholic Church, of course, came over to administer to the Native American Indians. And it didn't take long before, in the New World, the Spanish colonies had classes that were determined by skin color. The native-born Spanish was, of course, the very top of the ladder. Then you had the Spanish-born, who were true Spanish, but they were born in the New World. And if they married an Indian, their children were called peninsulars. If they married a black, the children were called mazitos. And then there was a slave. Now, Spain ordered the single men to marry because there was a shortage of Spanish women over there, and the Spanish women didn't really want to go. This picture, I think, is also in your text. It just shows the 4 racial groups. You've got the top left is your native born in Spain, Spanish, and then the second one to the right is your true Spanish, but born in this New World. And then in the bottom left, you've got the Spanish who married the Indian, and then the Spanish who married the black. So you've got your 4 racial groups, and as you notice, each group gets a little bit darker in complexion. The justification for all this was to spread Catholicism because we've got some problems going on in Europe. In 1517, a monk by the name of Martin Luther, he didn't intend to start the Protestant Reformation. I mean, he was just upset at what the church was doing. And for you non-Catholics, an indulgence is kind of like, well, if you've ever played Monopoly and you had this get-out-of-jail-free card, well, the Catholic Church doesn't believe that when you die, you go straight to heaven. You go to a kind of a waiting room called purgatory, and people have to pray you out of purgatory into heaven, or you stay there forever. But the church is selling basically an indulgence. You give me so much money to help me build my church, and we'll let you not go to purgatory, go straight to heaven. And Martin Luther thought this wasn't right. Like I say, Spain is the bastion of the Orthodox Catholicism. And to prevent this spread of Protestantism, now if you look, no, I didn't mean that to happen. Go on back. Come on back. Okay. Take this word out. You got protest. P-R-O-T-E-S-T. Basically, they're protesting some of the methods of the Catholic Church. That's it. That's what Protestantism is. And Reformation, if you look, think of the word R-E-F-O-R-M is the first of it. They just wanted to reform the Catholic Church. They had no intention of starting a new faith of any kind. But this Protestantism began to spread. And to prevent it from coming over to the New World and to convert these Native Americans to the true faith of Catholicism, well, we must save their souls, even if we have to force them into labor to do this. And here you can see we have more coming out of Spain now than we do out of Portugal. Down to South America, but this is where the bastion of it is. This is where the most of it is. You've got the Holland is going over to this way. France does it eventually, but right now it's in the Caribbean. That's where the biggest portion is. 1537, Pope Paul II outlawed enslaving the Indians. And a Dominican priest called Las Casas, he started complaining of the Indian cruelty at the hands of the Spanish. He said the only justification for building an empire was to convert the Indians to Christianity. And the result of his writings is called the Black Legend. Now, don't get Black Legend and Black Ships confused. It's two entirely different things. Black Legend is the story of the mistreatment of the Indians. So in 1542, the Spanish established something called the repartimento system, where now we're going to pay Indians wages for their work, and we're not going to sell them like slaves. They're going to be legally free, but they're going to be required to perform labor for our government. And of course, they're still mistreated. Yeah, it got better over time, but not that much and not that quick. So the Spanish Empire, Mexico predominantly, Peru, and the West Indies. Oh man, they're just thick with thieves. Ponce de Leon, and this is a very, very short little video. I thought it was kind of cute about Ponce de Leon. I think it's 2 minutes. Won't take you long. If they have.
Okay, Google. How much does an elephant weigh?
Ponce de Leon was the Spanish governor of Puerto Rico. He had arrived in the New World aboard Columbus's second voyage. He had become governor after he had led an expedition from Hispaniola to survey the island and begin settlement. After a number of years of being governor of Puerto Rico, he became embroiled in a political fight for control of the island. In the meantime, word had reached Spain of a rich land to the west. Ponce de Leon received a charter from the Spanish government to explore the land and share personally in any wealth he found. On March 4, 1513, Ponce de Leon commanded a small fleet of 3 ships, the Santiago, the San Cristobal, and the Santa Maria de la Consolidación, that set out to explore the lands to the west. On April 2, 1513, he spotted land, which he believed initially to be another Caribbean island. He named it Le Florida. The next day, they came ashore to claim the land for Spain. The location of the landing was most likely St. Augustine. The fleet spent the next 2 months exploring the coast of Florida, sailing around the southern tip of Florida, and exploring the west coast. Finally, they headed home, with Leon returning to Puerto Rico on October 19th. Ponce de Leon returned to Florida in 1521 with a group of 200 would-be settlers. Native Americans attacked the settlers, and Ponce de Leon was mortally injured. The settlers retreated to Havana, where Ponce de Leon died. Ponce de Leon is known as the explorer of Florida. For much of history, de Leon was also known for his search for the Fountain of Youth in Florida. All accounts that he was searching for the Fountain of Youth came after his death, and thus are suspect.
I love that. And thus is suspect. Juan Rodriguez Cabello went to the Pacific coast as far north as Oregon. I know I was really surprised when I lived in Kansas. Sometimes we'd be out plowing in the field and we'd find not just only Indian arrowheads, but we'd find a Spanish coin or something. Coronado examined the interior of the Western Plains, and everywhere these men went, they took with them the diseases of Europe. I believe this is also in your textbook. It's just basically giving you an estimated population of the Americas. When these Westerners or other Europeans arrived, there was something like 54 million, almost 55 million Indians that we are pretty sure were here. Spanish Florida. You see, France and England and all these other countries, they see all these black ships coming back, just loaded down with jewels, and they'd really like to have part of it. And what easier way to gain riches than to capture a Spanish ship loaded with gold and to go out there and dig it up yourself? So the French sent a group over to the New World to establish a colony. They called it Fort Caroline, and they were going to use it as a base to go out and hunt for the Spanish ships. Well, didn't take long for the Spanish to find out what was going on, so they established what is going to be the longest lasting European settlement in the country, St. Augustine, as an outpost to take care of things. And they immediately set out to Fort Caroline, and they destroyed every man that was there, destroyed the fort. They also kept going along the northeast coast all the way up to South Carolina. They were going to try to convert the Indians, but the Indians didn't prove too receptive to their efforts. But Spain in the Southwest, well, they kept going on and exploring and killing Indians and terrorizing people, but they never found any gold. And anytime the Indians would try to fight back, there would be extremely brutal retaliation. This is a coma, the Sky Cities, that appears in 1914. We don't know for sure why they built their houses up like that, whether it was to get away from periodic floods, or whether to get away from enemies, to make it harder for the enemies to get them, was it cooler up higher? We don't know, because by the time we discovered the villages, there wasn't anybody home. They've got something called the Inquisition in Spain, and the Inquisition is basically a trial to try to get rid of their Protestantism, and if you will, of course, reconvert to Catholicism, you can be okay. But the questions they would ask you and the methods of, shall we say, interrogation were a little bit rough. So while the Inquisition is intensified in Spain, the local priests' efforts to convert Indians become even more intense. They started burning their idols, and they burned their masks and their sacred objects. And they were unable to protect them from the Navajo and the Apache, which loved to attack them. And then we had a drought. Well, this was just more than the Pueblo Indians could take. So even though they were divided, an Indian by the name of it's got Popey here. He organized an uprising to drive out the Spanish. And more than 400 Spanish settlers were killed, plus 21 missionaries. So the Spanish abandoned Santa Fe. And while they were gone, they destroyed anything that reminded them of Spanish. Their trees that they brought over to plant, the cattle that they brought over, any church that they built. And they began to rebuild their old ways of worship. They even went into the rivers to wash away the baptism, because they had baptized them in the water. But warfare breaks out among the tribes, and the Navajo and the Apache raids continue, and Pepe dies. And in comes Spain again, and she reconquers New Mexico. So as you can see, even though we didn't have the Panama Canal here, to get here you had to go across that isthmus or go all the way around South America, which was very treacherous. But Peru was so rich in the jewelry. Here's Florida. Now if you look real closely, this is about where New Orleans would be today. And if you follow it up, here is what is now called the Mississippi River. You come on back down the Mississippi River, and you see here's the Ohio River breaking off. A little bit further where St. Louis is, you'd see the Missouri River breaking off. But this is where they were concentrating in this part of the continent. This area is the Aztecs, and on down and through here. But basically they're staying in the Caribbean area or in the Southwest or South America. The estimated regional populations of the world, close to 500 million, we figure, was the world population. And if you look at the Americas, when they got here in 1554 million was the population here. But other countries, as I said, wanted the wealth from New World. And they used the excuse that Spain is just treating the Indians horribly. Well, so did the English and the French and the Dutch. The French colonization began in the area that we call Canada. They were looking for that infamous Northwest Passage. They're still looking for that all-water route across the continent. And they settled in Canada and established colonies along the Mississippi and the Hudson River. And they began to claim all of the Ohio River. Now let's go back just a minute to that. They're claiming all this area in through here. Here's the Ohio River, here's the Mississippi, and the French are claiming all this area. Unlike the Spanish, the French treated the Indian with some modicum of respect. They traded with them, they made treaties and honored them. They lived in the Indians' villages, they married their women. And the Jesuits, which is a very rigid branch of the Catholic priests, they tried to convert the Indians, but were tolerant of their native languages to a point. And they did not exploit Indian labor, which was good, but they also brought with them diseases. And without even realizing it, the local Indians are going to get drawn into what we call continental wars. These innocent people who have nothing to do with the people of France and Spain and England are going to be involved in wars between France and England and Spain. All this green is what France is claiming. You've got all the Great Lakes, and like I say, here is the Mississippi, and here is the Ohio River. They're claiming all this. They also claim all the way down to, they have a little settlement, the French have a little settlement down here called New Orleans. The pink, of course, is Holland, New Amsterdam. Technically, the Spanish are claiming everything else. But before long, there's going to be another group coming along. Henry Hudson explored the New York Harbor and River, which is named for him. And this is a very, very short, I think it's a minute and a half, little YouTube on Mr. Hudson.
Henry Hudson, an Englishman working for the Dutch, in this little Dutch ship called the Half Moon that is only 85 feet long. He's exploring the east coast of North America. He pokes his nose into New York Harbor, what is today New York Harbor. He spies the river that now bears his name and sails north of it, expecting to find Asia. Well, we know that the Hudson River doesn't take you to China. Disappointed, he leaves and goes back home to Europe. Little did he know that as the result of his explorations, the Dutch would found a territory that would stretch from Delaware Bay at the southern end of today's New Jersey to the Connecticut River, and at its center, its most important node of activity, the Hudson River Valley, and the two cities they found to cap it at the northern end, Beaverwick, we call it Albany, and at its southern end, New Amsterdam, on that island across the bay. Hi, I'm Barry Lewis. Welcome to Dutch New York.
In 1542, New Amsterdam was established. Now, in Europe, even though it's a small country, it was a center of culture and enlightenment, and they had a huge maritime trade empire. They're the ones that invented this thing called the Joint Stock Company, which we get into pretty soon. It was just a place to be. It was very modern. It's kind of like going to New York City today. You want to go where there's life, and there's so much going on. They're also the center of banking. While in Europe they had a lot of freedoms, in the New Netherlands, in the New World, they did not, because it was a colony founded by the West India Tea Company and run very militarily. Unfortunately, they had slaves, but the slaves had some rights. They had something called half freedom there that was very unusual, because let's be honest about it. I've got a slave. I can't keep him busy 12 months out of the year. So he'll do work for me for, say, 3 or 4 months. Then I'll let him go into town and live on his own and work on his own, and he doesn't necessarily have to give me any money, but he has to promise to help protect the colony in case of Indian attack. He'll be required to go into the militia. He'll have his own business. He'll be very respected, and then come back and work 2 or 3 months out of the year for me. And although he was still a slave, half freedom was better than no freedom. Women enjoyed certain freedoms. They could make wills. They could divorce and marry. A lot of religious toleration, because they just recently gotten rid of the Catholic rule from Spain, and we had all different kinds of people there. So ethnic diversity is very intense. But the West India Company had to loosen control, because more and more land is getting into the hands of the richer, bigger farmers or landowners. The same thing's going to happen in the American South. So it began to offer incentives for the settlement, and whereas before the only slaves that were owned by the West India Company, they started letting other people have slaves. But these new landowners, especially the large ones, very, very dominant. They make our southern landowners look like pussycats. They started having rebellions between the poor folk and the large landowners. And New Amsterdam never became a large colony. In reality, they were more interested in trade than colonies anyway, because they were recently liberated from Spanish rule and Celtic oppression. But they did recognize the Indian sovereignty over the land, and they forbid any settlement until you could get a clear legal title to purchase the land from the Indians. But you've got two different cultures here. I mean, no matter how you look at it, there's going to be some problems. And then, of course, England is rearing her ugly head and growing like crazy. And after a series of wars that started over trade, New Amsterdam lost to England, and New Amsterdam is going to become New York because the land was going to be given, the entire area was going to be given to the Duke of York, which was the king's brother. So this covers pretty much what's going on in the New World. And we're going to begin our journey of the English into the New World because this is basically where we're all from. So you've got French to the north. You've got the Dutch in that little piece in the middle. You got Spanish to the south, and you got Native Americans all around. Virgin land? No. It wasn't virgin when the Europeans arrived, and it didn't even stay with the original inhabitants. So the next segment we're going to learn about will be about the English explorers and settlers. Now take a break and work your short quiz.